The magnificent Mrs. Solemnis deserves a much longer presentation than the very short one that follows. Here I will simply introduce two important issues to consider as you listen to and do your score study of the 90-minute work. First, you should consider the relationship of Beethoven's Mrs. Solemnis to traditions of church music. Second, you should ask yourself what it means to think of the Mrs. Solemnis as a work that puts religious ideas to musical expression. How might you qualitatively describe the spirituality heard in this composition? What do we know about Beethoven's own intentions for this work? As you know from your reading, Beethoven composed the Missa Solemnis for his patron and pupil Archduke Rudolph. He did not finish it in time for Archduke Rudolph's installation as the Archbishop of Olmütz. Indeed, it is hard to imagine this huge 90-minute work as only a small part of the larger installation festivities. Although trained as a Catholic church musician, Beethoven did not write or play much church music after moving to Vienna. By the time Beethoven was composing music, the church was no longer the primary musical patron of the Western world. Beethoven had only written an occasional mass or oratorio before embarking on the Missa Solemnis project. Beethoven had done somewhat extensive study of great works by Handel, Bach, Mozart, and Haydn. The composer had a copy of Handel's Messiah. If you listen closely, you might even hear a bit of this work in the Missa Solemnis. The composer, Beethoven, also requested a copy of Bach's Monumental Mass in B minor on more than one occasion. As there were copies of the work in the libraries of Beethoven's Viennese patrons and friends, it is likely that he may have studied the composition. Beethoven had studied the Mozart's Requiem in some detail, and as you may also know and recall, Beethoven had been in attendance at least one performance of Haydn's Creation. As you may also recall, 3 movements of the Missa Solemnis received their Viennese premiere on May 7, 1824. This was at the same concert that introduced the Ninth Symphony to the public. The reception of the work was generally positive, although some critics were puzzled by what they perceived as the secular symphonic styles used. You should note that the 3 movements were marketed as German hymns rather than as movements of the Mass, which facilitated their performance in concert. Unlike oratorio performances, Masses were still considered to be music for religious worship within the context of a church service for many early 19th century Europeans. Thus, in some towns, performances of masses and concerts were forbidden. The Missa Solemnis sets the standard 5 movements of the Mass Ordinary, the Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus and Benedictus, and the Agnus Dei. Critics have diverged in their opinions about the relationship of the Missa Solemnis to more traditional settings of the Catholic Mass. This has led many to note a more widespread shift toward personal religious expression over parochial liturgical worship in early 19th century Europe. One perhaps can hear this shift in Beethoven's composition. This concludes a very short presentation about the Missa Solemnis. I hope you are inspired to read more about the Missa Solemnis and also to listen to and study its score with the attention it deserves.